Welcome back, my friends, to The Mortals, where we step into the shadows of life's rawest of stories. The ones that break us, the ones that haunt us, and sometimes the ones that stitch us back together. And this is the place for the close calls, the whispered warnings, the moments when death reached out and something else reached back. And if you're new here, or if you've yet to hit that follow button, you gotta beware, because rumor has it, if you do not join the Mortals community now, you'll find yourself at a funeral. You're fumbling with the hymn book as the casket creaks open, all eyes on you. Because the casket's haunted, the funeral home's haunted, and you're being fumbly with your fingers. Anyway, don't be that soul. Spare yourself the haunting. Follow now and step into the unknown with all of us. And consider leaving us a positive review wherever it is you listen, on whichever platform. Today, we're diving into two stories of the fall and the fire, and the voice that brought someone back from the edge. These are tales of ambition, of loss, of grief, grit, of defying the inevitable in ways that defy all reason. So let's descend into the darkness together. These two tales today are true, both of them. They're heavy with the weight of what we can't explain. Because first, we're going to ascend to the towering heights of the Eiffel Tower in 1912 with a man who we'll call Franz a tailor with wings of his own making and a grief that drove him to leap. It's a story of ambition and loss and a fall that echoed across the world, a testament to the lengths that we will go to save what's already gone. And then in part two, we're going to walk through the fire with a man named Walter. In 1991, Miami, he survived an urban blaze that should have consumed him, guided by a voice that no one else heard. And both stories ask, what decides who lives and who doesn't? Who whispers in the dark to pull us through? Let's find out together. It's February 4th, 1912, Paris. A mantle of frost clings to the city, and a small, curious crowd gathers at the base of the Eiffel Tower, their breath puffing white in the bitter cold. They're here to witness something unheard of. A man whose name is Franz test a device of his own design, a wearable parachute, a set of wings to defy death itself. But this isn't just about spectacle. Franz is chasing more than glory. He's running from a grief that's gnawed at him for years. The loss of his brother, who plummeted to his death in a tragic construction accident just a few years prior to this. And Franz wants to save the world from the fall. So today, he's betting his life on it. Franz was born all the way back in 1879 in a very small Austrian town, a place of rolling hills and very tight-knit families where the clatter of looms and the snip of scissors were the rhythm of daily life. He was a slight boy with deft hands and a mind that wandered around further than the fields outside his window. And his brother, Karl, who is 2 years older, was his anchor, broad-shouldered, quick to laugh, a mason who built with brick and mortar, while Franz dreamed with thread and needle. Their bond was iron, and it was forged in late-night whispers about leaving for the city, dreaming about making names that would echo beyond their little town. But in 1905, Karl, working on a church steeple, lost his footing on a very slick scaffold. He plummeted 3 stories, the ground claiming him before Franz could even say goodbye. Franz, just 26 then, he saw the world tilt after that, the earth a thief that he'd never forgive. So he moved to Paris in 1907, chasing this new life, but the ache of Karl's loss seemed to follow him. He set up a smaller tailor's shop in a district of artisans where the cobblestone smelled of rain and ambition. And by day, he mended trousers and hemmed coats, but by night, his mind soared upward, always upward, away from the ground that stole Karl. He'd sketch ideas on scraps of butcher paper late into the night, his breath visible in the cold of his unheated room, dreaming of ways to keep the living from the fall. He'd read in journals about the pull of the earth, how it was a merciless force, a predator that didn't care who it took. I'll stop it, he'd mutter, alone with his ink and grief. I'll make something to cheat the dirt. By the early 1900s, Franz had turned his full attention to what he called his parachute suit. It was a device of wool and wire that could, in theory, slow a man's descent from deadly heights. It was a time when aviation was in its infancy. For Franz, it wasn't just about progress. It was personal. Every high place reminded him of Carl. Every sudden drop, a blade in his ribs. He'd spend hours in the margins of his tailoring ledgers, doodling contraptions of fabric and frame, muttering he'd seen the way the ground stole lives, and he hated it, hated the earth's cruel grip that didn't care who it seemed to crush. On that cold morning of February 4th, 1912, Franz prepared for the first platform of the Eiffel Tower, 187 feet above the earth. He's dressed in his device, wool layers, broad wings of heavy fabric, a parachute stitched into the arms like a bird's frame. Authorities thought he'd use a dummy. The press begged him to reconsider, but Franz, his eyes were set on glory, on grief, on proving something. I want to show the value of my work, he said, though the wind nearly stole those words. Some saw him tremble as he climbed, his hands gripping the icy railing with a mix of dread and defiance, and others said they saw peace in his lined face, as if he'd already made peace with the risk. The crowd below, their breath a white cloud in the frost, they all leaned in, half expecting a miracle, half bracing for disaster. Franz had spent years perfecting this design, testing it in secret, away from the mocking eyes of Paris, in empty fields where the wind was his only companion. He'd dragged mannequins to the tops of low hills, strapped them into his wings, and hurled them off, only to watch them crumple, the fabric tearing like paper, the frame snapping like brittle bone. Each failure was a knife, but it was also a step, a whispered apology to Carl that he'd get it right the next time. He'd sat in his workshop after each test, surrounded by the wreckage of the last attempt, his hands stained with dirt and oil, muttering, I'm close, brother." And though the world saw a fool, Franz saw a lifeline and a way to stitch the heavens to the earth, to keep anyone else from that drop. He'd written letters home late at night by the dim light of an oil lamp, promising his family he'd make it, that he'd save others from this fall. He'd sat in cafes, sketching on scraps of paper, muttering about fabric and wind and the weight of loss. He'd seen his brother's face in every cloud, every high window, every steep ledge. And now, as he reached this platform, the city stretching out like a map of his pain, he felt the weight of that grief more than ever before. The iron of the tower was cold against his palms, a stark contrast to the fire of his purpose. He told his assistant just days before that he felt a presence, a guiding hand, pushing him to this edge. And as he looked down, the ground a dizzying patchwork of risk and memory, he knew there was no retreat. The crowd below held their breath as Franz perched on the edge. His device, this patchwork of hope, desperation, fluttered in the wind. His face, lined with years of late-night toil, was set in a grim mask of focus. I'm ready, he thought, though no one heard. The press, with their notebooks and cameras, scribbled furiously. A young boy in the crowd, clutching his mother's hand, whispered, "Is he a bird?" And the mother, her eyes wide, could only shake her head. Franz, in that moment, was more than a man. He was a symbol of something raw, something aching to be remembered. And then, with a final glance at the gray sky, a murmured word to his brother's memory, Franz spread his wings. The fabric snapped taut for a heartbeat of fleeting hope. The wind seemed to pause, as if giving him one last chance. The crowd leaned forward, their breaths visible, waiting for the miracle. A woman in a heavy cloak, standing at the back, whispered a quick plea to the saints, her eyes never leaving Franz. A journalist, pencil trembling, jotted down, "He looks like a man fleeing something." Then Franz, in his mind, was fleeing the ground, the grief, the weight of a world that did not care. But the moment stretched, taut as a bowstring, and the truth crept in. The wings, though born of love and loss, were not enough. The fabric sagged awkwardly, the frame too frail for the gale. Franz, for a split second, seemed to float, a silhouette against the iron lattice, a man defying the pull. And then, as if the earth itself reached up, he began to tilt. The wind, no longer a chorus but a blade, sliced through his dream. The crowd's gasps were swallowed by the howl as Franz's ascent became a descent, a slow, inevitable spiral toward the cobblestone below. Franz and his wings they did not hold. They crumpled inward like paper in a fist as he plunged. The crowd gasped this single breath of horror. A young journalist wrote, "There was a moment of silence, then a sound like a sack of flour striking the earth from the heavens. The impact was instantaneous. 187 feet of dream and grief meeting the unyielding ground. Cameras clicked, a cruel chorus capturing the end. Newsreels across Paris, then Europe, then the world replayed the fall over and over, dubbing him the Flying Tailor. But they didn't see the note in his jacket, folded tight against his heart. A last word to his brother, a whispered apology for not making it in time. The world mocked Franz, turned his tragedy into a sideshow, a cautionary joke. But buried in the laughter was a truth. Franz was not far from right. His design, with just a few tweaks years later, became the seed of modern wingsuits. Base jumpers today owe a thread to his grief, though they don't know his name. Standing at the Eiffel Tower today, in the wind that still remembers, you can hear the echo of a man who wanted to save us all from the fall. But the ground took him first. And in that cold, iron-shrouded moment, death didn't wait for Franz to soar. It waited only to claim him. Franz's story didn't end with the impact. It lingered in the workshops of Paris, where other dreamers took up his sketches, refining what he'd started. It lingered in the newsreels, a cautionary flicker for generations, a man who leapt too soon. It lingered in the family that he left behind, who read of a son, a brother, who tried to stitch the heavens to the earth. And it lingered in the very air around the tower, where the wind seemed to carry a whispered regret, a plea for just one more chance. The ground, though, was merciless, and Franz's wings, born of grief, became his shroud. But in that fall, there was a seed, a reminder that sometimes, to save others, we risk everything. Paris in 1912 was a city of invention and risk, a place where the new century's shine was tempered by the shadows of old loss. Franz's family, back in Austria, received the news through a cold telegram. The words stark against the paper. Franz deceased. Accident at Eiffel Tower. His mother, aged beyond her years by loss, clutched Karl's old mason tools as she wept for her second son, wondering if the earth had cursed them all. His sister, who'd once sewn alongside him, kept a scrap of his fabric, a piece of his failed wings, as if holding it could bring him back. They buried him in a small Parisian cemetery, far from home, his grave a quiet marker of a dream too heavy to hold. And though the world moved on, the family carried the double weight of Karl and Franz, two brothers, lost to the pull of the ground. And in the years that followed, Franz's story became this whispered caution among inventors. this tale of ambition unchecked by reason. Aviation historians digging through dusty archives would note his attempt as a footnote, a tragic precursor to safer designs. But for those who stood at the Eiffel Tower in the decades after, gazing up at the iron lattice, there was something else. This sense of a man still there, still reaching, still falling. Tour guides, in hushed tones, would recount the tale of the flying Tailor, though they'd omit the note in his pocket, the grief that drove him. And on windy days, when the tower creaked and moaned, some would swear they heard a faint apology, a tailor's last stitch against the inevitable. This story, it cuts deep. It's not just about this fall. It's about what we carry when we climb. It's about the grief that pushes us to edges that we're not ready for, the dreams we build from loss that can either save us or shatter us. I've stood at the base of that tower. I've felt the wind bite, and I've wondered what I'd risk to save someone that I've lost. I mean, haven't we all? Haven't we all built wings from our pain, hoping to soar past the hurt, only to find the ground waiting? Franz didn't make it, but his leap, his desperate, broken leap, it reminds us that sometimes the fall is the price of the dream. And in that cold, iron-shrouded moment, though death claimed him, it didn't claim his purpose. Let's shift to the swelter of 1991, downtown Miami, Florida. Temperatures are kissing the 90s, and the air is thick with heat and hustle. Inside the historic Alfred DuPont Building, a once grand bank turned office space, the day hums along. Elevators whir, phones ring, papers shuffle. But at 11:43 a.m., a very small electrical fault in the basement sparks a blaze that'll soon swallow 4 floors. And on the 14th floor, a man named Walter, a 47-year-old data clerk, divorced, alone, faces a death so certain, fire crews stop even trying to reach him. Until a voice no one else heard guided him out. Walter wasn't a stranger to loss. He'd been through a bitter divorce 2 years prior, leaving him with little but his service dog, Daisy, a scruffy mutt who'd been his anchor through lonely nights. He'd taken the job at the DuPont Building because it was stable and a place to rebuild after life had unraveled. He'd moved to Miami after the split, chasing this fresh start, but the city's heat and noise often felt like a second weight on his already weary frame. He'd written late-night letters to his ex that he never sent, scrawled on motel stationery about starting over, about finding something worth holding on to again. He'd sat in dive bar corners, muttering to himself about fires he'd escaped in his mind, about the way life burned you without flame, and now, in this towering building, he was about to face a real one. Miami, in 1991, was a city of contrasts. Gleaming glass towers, cheek by jowl with crumbling tenements. A place where the American dream was both polished and appealing. And the DuPont Building, built in the 1920s, had been a bank for the city's elite before the Depression turned its marble halls into echoes, then an office block for the working class, just like Walter. And by the late 80s, it was a patchwork of modern wiring and old bones, a tinderbox waiting for a match. Fire safety was a gamble, with budget cuts leaving sprinklers outdated and alarms prone to false cries. And for workers on the upper floors, like Walter on the 14th, the risk was this daily roll of the die, though most didn't think about it until the air turned to ash. Walter's life before the fire was a series of small, hard-won routines. Coffee at 6 with Daisy by his side, a walk through a littered lot at 7, a late shift at the plaza to avoid the morning crush. He'd been a data clerk for 3 years, inputting numbers into flickering terminals, his hands more used to keyboards than heroism. But the plaza, with its marble halls, echoing hallways, it felt like a cage on days when the air was heavy. when the city seemed ready to ignite. He'd lost his wife to distance, his kids to time, and now, in this job, he felt the slow loss of himself. Though he clung to Daisy like a lifeline, he'd often stare out the 14th floor window past the smudged glass at the Miami skyline, wondering if there was a way out of the grind that didn't end in ash. The fire started small, and a faulty wire, a stray paper. But when the sprinklers failed, it roared vertical, up shafts, through floors. Smoke billowed, glass burst, furniture melted into slag, and Walter's co-workers fled. But Walter lingered, hunting for Daisy, spooked by the first blast. The last anyone saw, he was staggering toward the stairwell. Flames were at his back, and by noon, Fire Command radioed, "No one on 14 is making it out." But Walter did. The blaze was a monster by 11:50 a.m., a wall of heat and black that turned the 14th floor into a furnace. And Walter, alone in the data room, had been clutching a photo of Daisy's collar when the first explosion rocked the building. He'd stumbled, hit his head on a filing cabinet, and for just a moment, the world swam in red and gray. Smoke poured in, thick as tar, and he'd coughed until his lungs ached. Each breath at this point is a battle. The alarms are screaming, a banshee wail, and through the haze, he'd seen Daisy dart toward the stairwell, her eyes wide with panic. He followed, crawling over debris, ignoring the heat that licked at his skin like a hungry beast. The ceiling groaned, a death groan, as he'd reached for the stairwell door, certain he'd never see the other side. And then, through the haze, a sound. Not the fire's roar, not the alarms, but something else. It was a voice to say, "Stay low, Walter. Move left, then right. Do not stop. Don't look back." A man's voice, deep, unhurried, as if the flames were not there. Walter froze, his breath a hitch in the soot, his eyes darting for the source, but only finding fire. "What? Who?" he croaked, but the voice didn't answer, only lingered in the air, like a command carved in ash. The heat at this point is bearing down. It's this weight, and he cannot stop coughing. Glass shards are littered all over the floor. He felt it as he's crawling more than he heard it. He was pushed. He was certain at this point that he needed to go this way no matter the pain and fear. Walter made it out of the Alfred DuPont Building that day in 1991, though the fire had marked him in ways the eyes didn't see. Firefighters found Walter in the stairwell at 1:03 p.m., nearly an hour into the blaze, soot-smeared, limping, clutching Daisy, who'd hidden under a landing. He was singed, but whole. No burns past first degree, no lung damage. His oxygen levels barely normal, according to stunned doctors. But Walter knew something that they didn't. He'd heard a voice in the fire, a man's deep and unhurried voice saying to stay low, to move left, then right. Don't stop. Don't look back. He had obeyed them, though no one else saw the guide, though the path, later called the only safe corridor by crews, hadn't been marked yet. And days later, in a hospital room smelling of antiseptic and ash, Walter whispered to a local reporter about the man in the flames. He wasn't burned, Walter said, his own eyes far off, staring at the ceiling as if it held the answer. He was cool, like he knew the fire better than me. The reporter, a young woman with a notepad trembling in her hand, jotted down the words but didn't press, sensing something heavier than her story. Walter's nurses, changing his dressings, exchanged glances. Hallucination? They figured, but who knew? Maybe from the heat or the hit to his head, but Walter, when they were gone, would mutter to Daisy, his dog, "We heard him, didn't we, girl? He got us out." And Daisy, curled at the bed's foot, would thump her tail once, as if she knew. The city moved on, the DuPont Building a charred husk for weeks, then rebuilt, its marble now a veneer over the memory of fire. Walter returned to work months later, slower, quieter, his data tapes a mundane anchor against the weight of this particular day. But he'd stare at the stairwell sometimes, on late shifts, wondering who had guided him, why they cared enough to speak. His co-workers, noticing the far look, whispered he'd seen death and come back wrong, though Walter never said more. He'd written a letter once, unsent, to his ex, about the man in the fire, about how he'd felt less alone in the flames than in their old home. Miami's fire reports called it a miracle. 83 were saved, one man on 14 defying odds. But for Walter, the miracle wasn't the living, it was the voice. Stay low, it said. And he did, though the world around him burned. He'd moved left, right, as commanded, though the path was invisible till he took it. And Daisy, trembling at his side in the hospital, seemed to remember too, her eyes on the door as if waiting for the man to step through again. The local paper, a week after, buried the story on page 7, only a footnote to the blaze's more broader toll. But Walter's name lingered in hushed tones among first responders who'd seen him stagger out, whole, against all reason. And years later, when the DuPont Building was long restored and Walter a gray-haired retiree, he'd sit on his porch in a quieter Miami, Daisy's collar now a worn relic on the shelf, and he'd tell his grandkids, half believing himself, that a man in the fire had saved him once. He wasn't burned, he'd say, and they'd laugh, thinking it a story, though Walter's eyes, far and heavy, said different. The city, with its new glass towers, had forgotten about the fire, but Walter had not, nor the voice that cut through the blaze like a blade of cool air. This story is a shiver. It's not just about surviving this fire, it's about who walks with us when the world seems to burn. I've felt that kind of heat in my own life, not from flames, but from moments when everything seemed to collapse, when I thought that I was alone, only to hear a whisper, maybe not a voice, but a nudge, a pull, something telling me to keep going. Haven't you? I know you have. Walter's story, it makes me wonder who's watching when we're at our breaking point. Who steps into this inferno when no one else can? Was it a guardian, a trick, or something older, something tied to the very air of that building or of this world? I don't have the answer, but I do feel the weight of the question every time I think of Walter staggering out, Daisy at his side, alive against all reason. Miami, in the early 90s, was no stranger to disaster. Hurricanes, crime waves, and fires like this one were part of the city's pulse. It was a reminder that paradise, it came at a price. And the DuPont Building fire wasn't the first to scar the skyline, nor the last, but it stood out for the sheer improbability of survivors like Walter. Fire safety reports from the time detail a litany of failures: outdated wiring, insufficient sprinklers, stairwells that became chimneys for smoke. And the city vowed reforms, of course, though the promises faded with the next budget cycle. But for those who worked in the rebuilt DuPont, the memory did linger, and it was a ghost in the polished marble, a whisper of heat in the air conditioning. And Walter's tale, though not splashed across headlines, it became a quiet legend among firefighters, a story told over late-night coffee in station houses about the man who walked through fire and heard a voice no one else did. Walter's life after the fire wasn't a straight line to recovery. He battled nightmares for many years. He'd wake up to the imagined roar of flames, reaching for Daisy, who'd long since passed. He'd moved to a quieter part of Miami, a small bungalow, far from downtown's glass and steel, though the city's heat still felt like a reminder. He had taken up odd jobs after leaving the data clerk gig, unable to face the 14th floor again. Even in a new building, he'd sit with his grandkids on weekends, telling them stories of Daisy, of the fire, though he'd soften the edges a bit, leaving out the voice until they were much older, until they could bear the weight of the unknown. And in his quiet moments, he'd pull out that old photo of Daisy's collar, tracing the worn edges, wondering if the man in the fire had been there for her too, if he'd saved them both for a reason he'd never grasp. But for the families of the 83 saved, and for Walter especially, it was a dividing line. Life before the flames and life after. Local lore grew around the building, whispers of a presence in the stairwells, a cool shadow amid the heat, though most dismissed it as trauma's echo. Firefighters, though, some of the old guard, would nod when Walter's name came up, muttering, "He should not have made it. Someone wanted him out." And in the city's underbelly, among those who'd seen too much, his story was a quiet talisman, a reminder that sometimes the impossible happens and you don't ask why. I keep going back to that voice that he heard. Stay low, move left, then right. It's pretty specific. It was certain, right? Like it knew the fire's map better than the flames themselves. I mean, I've sat with that late at night, wondering who or what seems to step in when we're out of moves and literally don't know which direction to turn. I've worked funerals. I've seen families grapple with loss that came too soon, and I've wondered myself if someone was there, unseen, trying to guide these families as well, but maybe couldn't. Walter's story isn't just this survival, it's a question, really. What if we're never as alone as we think in our darkest moments? What if someone decides that we're not done, even when the world burns all around us? I don't know. But I feel that in the shiver of Walter's tale, in the way Daisy looked at the door, waiting for a man who never came through again. Franz and Walter. Two men, two eras, two brushes with death. One plunged from the heavens, chasing grief, and found no voice to save him. The other walked through a wall of flame, chasing a companion, guided by a presence no one else knew. Death waited for Franz, but it passed Walter. Why? What decides who stays and who goes? Is it chance? Instinct? A voice? Quiet, unseen, that whispers? Not yet. I don't have the answers, but I do live for the questions. The ones that linger in the shadows of what we cannot prove. If you've heard that voice, if you've felt that presence in your own close call, I want to hear it. Join the Mortals community. It's a space for deeper conversations, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, early access to episodes, and a chance to connect with yours truly and others who feel the chill of these stories just like you do. Members, you get early access to episodes, bonus content, and a direct line to share your own experiences. You also get major discount codes. Check out the link in the description or visit nathanmorrismusic.com to join. Your story might be the one that we tell next. And remember, new episodes drop every Tuesday and Thursday, so don't miss a single tale. The best way to support this podcast is to share it with someone, buy merch like the "Hello, I'm probably anxious" tee, because you probably are. Get you some special discounts by joining the Mortals. I do appreciate you listening to this show, The Mortals, where the walls come down, the mysteries stay unsolved, and sometimes the answers only lead to darker questions. But I like it that way. Until next time, take care of yourselves. You're loved far more than you could ever know.